What was the Super Bowl like in every era? To answer that, we have to start with the pre-Super Bowl era to figure out how we even got a Super Bowl in the first place. And that story starts with a 26-year-old oil heir named Lamar Hunt, who just wanted to own a football team. In 1958, Hunt approached the NFL about putting a franchise in Dallas, and the league denied his request. So instead, he tried to buy the Chicago Cardinals and move them to Dallas, and once again, the NFL told him no because they had zero interest in expanding at the time, especially not for some rich kid who thought that he knew it all. Most of us get rejected and we move on. Or maybe we send a drunk text that we later regret, but not Lamar Hunt. He wasn't ready to take no for an answer, so he actually went and started his own professional football league. To do this, he found 7 other businessmen who had either been rejected or frozen out by the NFL, and together they launched the American Football League in 1960. They gave themselves a sick nickname and called their group the Foolish Club because in those early years they were each losing around $1 million per year just trying to keep the league alive. The NFL rightfully assumed that this new league would collapse just like every other rival league that had tried and failed before them. But the AFL did something that the NFL didn't even think was in the realm of possibility. They started a bidding war for players. And the first shot came in 1960 when the Houston Oilers went after Billy Cannon, who was the reigning Heisman Trophy winner. The Rams had already signed him, but the Oilers offered double the money, and Cannon signed with Houston right after the Sugar Bowl while he was still in his sweaty uniform. The Rams would end up suing the AFL over this, but the case would be dismissed. And Billy Cannon became pro football's first player ever to receive a contract worth $100,000. This was the moment that the NFL realized that the AFL was nothing like those other leagues that had died before them. They were more like a crazy ex who starts dating your friends just to try and make your life a living hell. And it only got crazier from there. The AFL would go to extreme lengths to hawk players from right under the NFL's nose. As the legendary story goes, the Cowboys had receiver Otis Taylor locked in a hotel room waiting to sign with them. And when a chief scout found out, he went to the hotel and snuck around back and tapped on Taylor's bathroom window, and Otis Taylor allegedly climbed out of that window to sign with Kansas City instead. Which, by the way, has to be one of the coolest NFL stories that I've ever heard. In 1964, the AFL continued their ascent and signed a TV deal with NBC worth $36 million. For a league that had spent 4 years getting laughed at and being told that their product wasn't real football, having a major network write a check like that proved that they were legitimate. And suddenly, the NFL's little bro wasn't looking so little anymore. That TV money only made things worse for the NFL. Now, both leagues were spending absurd amounts of money trying to outbid each other for college talent, and by 1966, it was bleeding everybody dry. Even through all the chaos and animosity, there was one line that neither league crossed. While the AFL had been poaching incoming rookies, there was an unwritten gentleman's agreement between the leagues that you don't go after players that are already playing in the other league. College kids were fair game, but established pros were completely off limits. That line would be crossed when the New York Giants got greedy and signed Pete Gogolak, a kicker who had played out his contract with the Buffalo Bills. This act of war broke that unwritten truce between the leagues. And as you might expect, the AFL's new commissioner, Al Davis, took that personally. In retaliation, he started signing NFL stars, guys like Mike Ditka and Roman Gabriel, to future contracts with AFL teams. And this is when the NFL realized that there was a real possibility that they could lose this battle if it continued. They felt that they had no choice but to come to the table and try and negotiate a merger with the very league that they'd spent half a decade mocking. The merger came with a condition. The AFL wanted a championship game between the two leagues to settle once and for all who was actually better. Of course, the NFL agreed without hesitation because in their minds, there was nothing to settle. They were going to wipe the floor with these imposters and prove that even though they had to merge, they were still the superior league. And just like that, the Super Bowl was born. Well, technically, it was called the AFL-NFL World Championship game because the NFL thought that the Super Bowl sounded undignified. But Lamar Hunt had been casually using the name Super Bowl in meetings, and that name was inspired by his kids who had a bouncy ball toy called a Super Ball. Even though the NFL hated the name, it stuck. The only question left was whether the AFL actually belonged on the same field as the NFL, which takes us to the Legitimacy Era. Before we get to the rest of the video, here's a quick word from today's sponsor. Everyone's got a hot take when it comes to the Super Bowl, and I'm no different. I think that Sam Darnold and the Seahawks will take home the Lombardi. And I will have to live with the fact that my Vikings chose 9 over a Super Bowl winning quarterback. And with the help of today's sponsor, Kalshi, I can actually put my money where my mouth is on that prediction. Kalshi is the largest legal prediction market in the US, and it's available in all 50 states. These are real money markets where people are trading on what they actually think will happen. Here's why it's different from a sportsbook. Sportsbooks set the odds against you, and if you start doing well, they can even limit you. Kalshi is peer-to-peer, meaning you're trading directly with other people, kind of like a stock market. And of course, there's no house to limit you if you start doing well. Here's an example of how it works. In the case of my trade, right now the markets think that there's a 68% chance that the Seahawks win. So if I'm correct and I buy $100 worth of contracts, my return would be $147. Kalshi has over 1 million users and has already done $2 billion in trades. Make your trade and earn based on what you know, and go to kalshi.com/Troyberg to get $10 when you trade 100. As always, be responsible and only trade what you can afford to lose. Link is in the description. Now back to the video. If you showed up to the first Super Bowl expecting anything close to what we have today, you would have been more disappointed than my parents when I told them at 7 years old that my dream was to become a street fighting magician. That first big game would be played at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, a stadium that held 94,000 people. Tickets were going for as low as $12, and despite the reasonable price, the NFL still couldn't manage to sell the game out, and a third of the stadium would be empty for that game. Like we already talked about, the NFL came into this game expecting to embarrass the AFL on national television, and Super Bowls 1 and 2 gave them exactly what they wanted. The Packers thunderclapped the Chiefs 35-10 in the first one, and then they came back the following year and beat the Raiders 33-14. Vince Lombardi's guys made it look easy, and the NFL's whole attitude of "we're the real league and the AFL guys are pretenders" seemed completely justified. The game that they'd agreed upon as a condition of the merger was turning into an annual humiliation ritual for the AFL. But Super Bowl III would be the game where the entire script flipped. The Baltimore Colts came into that game having gone 13-1 during the regular season. People were calling them the greatest team ever assembled. They were favored by 18 points against the Jets, and most fans thought that the NFL would once again reign supreme. Former NFL star Norm Van Brocklin was asked before the game what he thought about Joe Namath, and he said he'd tell everyone what he thought about Joe on Sunday night after Joe played his real first professional game. Obviously, the Jets quarterback had been playing professional football for 4 years at that point, but in the NFL's eyes, those silly AFL matchups weren't worth being called pro football. Joe Namath had a response of his own, and while he was at the Miami Touchdown Club, some hecklers started giving him a hard time about how badly the Colts were about to beat them. And Broadway Joe uttered the infamous words, "We're gonna win the game, I guarantee it." And as we all know, Namath would fulfill that promise, and the Jets would go on to win 16-7 in a massive upset. That game changed everything, not just for the Jets or for Namath, but for the entire AFL and what the merger was going to look like moving forward. Before Super Bowl III, the merger felt like the NFL was absorbing a lesser league. After Super Bowl III, it was a partnership between equals. The AFL had proven on the biggest stage that they belonged. And if anyone thought that the Jets were a fluke, the Chiefs made sure to correct that thinking the following year when they beat the Vikings 23-7 in Super Bowl IV. The AFL went back-to-back against the league that had been telling them for a decade that they weren't good enough. Even though the two leagues had been operating as one league for the last 4 years, it wasn't until 1970 when the merger was finalized, and the two leagues officially became one unified NFL with two conferences, the AFC and the NFC. 3 teams from the old NFL, the Colts, the Browns, and the Steelers, moved over to the AFC to balance things out. With the legitimacy of the league no longer up for debate, a new question emerged. If both sides of the league were now on equal footing, what teams were going to dominate the league for years to come? And the answer to that question would define the next era of the Super Bowl, the Dynasty Era. In the early 70s, the Super Bowl was still finding its footing. Viewership was growing, but the game hadn't yet reached the cultural status that it would later achieve. What would push the Super Bowl into the mainstream was the emergence of dynasties, multiple franchises that kept winning and reappearing year after year, giving fans something to root for or to root against. There was no salary cap during this era, so teams that drafted well could keep their players together for as long as they wanted. The Dolphins won back-to-back Super Bowls, including the perfect season that every Dolphins fan over 50 has definitely told you about. The Pittsburgh Steelers won 4 Super Bowls between 1974 and 1979 behind their famous Steel Curtain defense. Cowboys also won 2 in the 70s and became so popular that they earned the nickname America's Team. You had real powerhouses showing up on the biggest stage year after year, and that consistency gave casual fans a reason to care. By the late 70s, Super Bowl XI pulled in around 80 million viewers, making it the most watched sports broadcast in American television history at that point. Which is pretty insane when you remember that just 10 years earlier, the NFL couldn't even sell out the first Super Bowl. From there, the league kept pushing. Super Bowl 12 would be the first Super Bowl broadcast in primetime, and viewership jumped by over 20 million people just from that time slot change alone. The NFL also changed some rules in 1978 to open up the passing game, mainly because defenses had become so dominant at that point that teams were only averaging around 17 points a game, which is great for people who love high-level defense, but it wasn't exactly thrilling television for casual fans. The San Francisco 49ers would go on to be one of the first to master this new era of football. Bill Walsh's West Coast offense turned short, precise passes into an art form, and Joe Montana was the perfect quarterback to run it. During this time, Montana and the 49ers won 4 Super Bowls, and he never threw a single interception in any of them. The Raiders won 3 Super Bowls and built a reputation as the villains of the league that fans either loved or absolutely despised. America's team would come back to dominance and win 3 Super Bowls in the early 90s, and we can't forget that during this era, the Giants and Redskins put together a couple of championship runs of their own. The dynasties just kept coming. The way that people experienced the Super Bowl was transforming too. Color television was in most American homes by now, which was a massive upgrade from the grainy black and white broadcasts of the first few Super Bowls. But more than that, the Super Bowl was becoming a social event. People weren't only watching the game, they were starting to throw entire parties for it. Friends and families would gather around the TV, and people who didn't even care about football would show up because the Super Bowl had become this thing that you did on that Sunday. Apple's famous 1984 commercial changed the game when it came to advertising, and companies began competing to create moments that people would talk about the next day. That one ad basically pioneered the idea that the Super Bowl commercials were worth watching on their own, and it's the reason that we still treat them like their own event today. And by the early 90s, the halftime show had evolved from marching bands into full-blown concerts. Michael Jackson's performance at Super Bowl 27 in 1993 was the first halftime show to actually increase viewership during the break instead of losing it. Even with all of the success that the Super Bowl and the league itself had undergone in the past couple of decades, the league was still worried about something. They were worried that the same teams winning year after year might make things feel like they're already predetermined. They really wanted fans of every franchise to believe that their team had a shot too. To address this, the league was about to introduce something that would change the competitive landscape forever, which is why I'd like to introduce you to the salary cap era. As the name might suggest, this era would be marked by one of the biggest changes that the NFL ever made, which was that in 1994, the NFL introduced a salary cap. This made it so that every team would have the same amount of money to spend on players. And the idea was that this would create a league where dynasties could no longer be built on deep pockets. The playing field was officially level. During the Dynasty era, 9 different teams won a Super Bowl over 23 years. In the salary cap era, 15 different franchises have won it all. Teams like the Ravens, Saints, Seahawks, and Eagles all got to experience winning a championship for the first time ever in their franchise's history. Fan bases that had spent decades watching other teams celebrate finally got their moment, and as a Vikings fan, I'm told that that's a wonderful experience. Now obviously the Patriots won 6 Super Bowls with Brady and Belichick, and the Chiefs have won 3 behind Andy Reid and Mahomes. So dynasties can definitely still happen, but in 30 years, those are the only 2 franchises that have been able to build anything close to the dominance of what we saw in the 70s and 80s. And I think that that's further proof that the cap has done its job. I'm not going to bore you with everything that's happened on the field during this era because most of you have probably lived through it. But what I do want to talk about is just how much the Super Bowl has transformed. Just think about where this thing started. Super Bowl I had 30,000 empty seats in a stadium that held 94,000. Today, tickets cost thousands of dollars and people still can't get them. Over 120 million people tune in every single year, and a 30-second commercial slot costs around $7 million. And companies spend months crafting those ads because they know that most of the country is watching. Not only that, but the halftime show has turned into a global spectacle that people who don't even watch football will tune in specifically to see. The way that people watch the Super Bowl has changed just as much. You don't need a TV in your living room anymore. You can stream the game on your phone from literally anywhere. And social media has turned it into a sharing experience where millions of people react in real time. In a little under 60 years, the Super Bowl has become an unofficial holiday, and it's the one night a year where it really does feel like half the country is doing the same thing at the same time. And it's crazy to think that all of it traces back to a 26-year-old who got rejected twice and couldn't take no for an answer. The NFL didn't want Lamar Hunt, and they didn't want his silly little name for the championship game either. But now that name is bigger than the game itself, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And that is your little Super Bowl history lesson before Super Bowl 60 this Sunday. If you enjoyed this video, you might also enjoy one of my other videos, which I put on screen right here. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch, and I hope everyone has a fantastic Super Bowl weekend. With that, I will catch you all in the next one.